that connotation that stays with you. And I think being a big feeler myself my whole life, whether it's in my body or in my brain, and being labeled so negatively for having such intense feelings, was a really big part of why it mattered to me, is that the connotation, it's a subconscious message you're sending, and it matters.
How do we help neurodivergent kids navigate emotional waves without getting pulled under by them? And what does it really mean to move from co-regulation to self-regulation? We're talking with occupational therapist Dr. Tracey DeMaria about bottom-up regulation, school-induced trauma, and why rethinking the language we use around behavior can make all the difference. That's straight ahead on episode 282. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris, and this is the Neurodiversity Podcast.
What is neurodiversity? You see the world differently.
Autism spectrum.
Gifted.
Complexities that are inherently inside.
ADHD.
Dysgraphia.
Tourette's.
All brains are different.
You are exactly what this world needs.
This is the
Neurodiversity Podcast.
There are so many webinars and trainings floating around, slide decks, talking heads, PDFs you'll never read. But once a year, we gather live for something different. Something that feels a little more personal. On Tuesday, September 9th at 8 p.m. Eastern, we're hosting our annual Creating Neurodiversity Affirming Schools virtual event for educators who are committed to building environments that work for neurodivergent kids. It's 90 minutes of real talk, shared experiences, and honest reflection. Amanda Morin, my co-author of Neurodiversity Affirming Schools, will be there with me, and we've invited a panel of educators who've been doing the work, making the mistakes, and seeing the shifts. It's free, it's live, and you get a certificate of completion for attending. Don't worry if you can't attend live, we'll send you the recording. This isn't just another thing to check off your PD list. It's a community event. I hope you'll join us. You can register at neurodiversity.university or click the link in the show notes. All right, Tracey is with me next.
previously on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
We use a lot of euphemisms. We use a lot of, metaphors for different things without really explaining what some of those are.
Yes, absolutely. You don't realize that your inner experience is different than someone else. So why even talk about it, right? Because you're just assuming that it's the same. And
right.
For example, as an occupational therapist, I was trained to assume to understand the emotions of my clients and label their emotions because that's going to help them understand how they're feeling. And what we're finding is that assuming to understand someone else's inner experience is really very derailing to many people, because when we assume to understand and I'm like, oh, it looks like you're frustrated right now. If I'm assuming, then I am very at high risk of being dead wrong.
That's episode 191. Find it wherever you get your podcasts.
Today, I'm talking with Dr. Tracey DeMaria, an occupational therapist who brings over 2 decades of experience to her work in schools, higher education, and mental health. Tracey specializes in regulation skills and sensory integration, areas that are foundational for helping kids and adults alike better understand and navigate their emotions and environments. She currently works in the Phillipsburg School District and teaches in the OT Master's Program at Moravian University. Tracey is neurodivergent herself and a passionate advocate for disability rights. Her work is all about helping people of all ages and neurotypes build the tools they need to thrive. Tracey, thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thank you, Emily. Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
So to start us off, I want to talk about something that I think really makes your work stand out, which is the way that you frame regulation skills using the idea of surfing the waves. I really love this analogy because it immediately gives us a visual that is dynamic and it's approachable. And I think for a lot of kids, and honestly for adults too, it makes the whole process of emotional regulation feel less clinical and more like a skill you can practice and get better at, like learning to ride actual waves. So can you share a little bit about how you decided to use that analogy and why you feel like it resonates so well, especially for neurodivergent kids?
The story on how I actually came up with surfing the waves was related to my family, which is all neurodivergent people, but my nephew at the time was struggling with managing his emotions, and he wrote a poem about surfing the waves of his feelings. And so his mother and I got together and we were just talking about it. And that was more than 20 years ago. So it just kind of has always been there as part of my clinical practice. And this analogy, I just really clung to it as well. And over the years, it has morphed and matured and just really became part of a way to look at this idea of unpleasant feelings and how we can, like you said, visualize them and look at that. There's a natural flow to ocean waves, and there's a natural flow to emotions and to body feelings, and that's part of being alive and being human and being part of the earth. It's just things get big and things are small, and I like that it normalizes things too.
This is something that I know I've talked about as well in my clinical practice, but I don't know that I've ever done a really great job of explaining it verbally to my clients. So I kind of get caught up in it a little bit. And I think that you do a really nice job just as far as recognizing, like, sometimes the waves are really small, sometimes they're a tsunami, this whole range. But I think the message that it really talks about and that it sends is that waves are temporary. They come and they go. And I think that for a lot of people, neurodivergent or not, regardless of their age, when you have those big emotions, they feel like they're going to last forever. And it feels really hard to get out of that. How do you approach this idea of the range of emotions and the intensity of the emotions, using this analogy of the waves, but also just kind of normalizing that experience and recognizing that even though it feels hard now, you're going to get through it?
I think it's actually easier when working with children. I have used some of these concepts with some older people, and we've done such a great job of teaching people that the big feelings are the ones you hide. And so I feel like for kids, especially if I'm getting them young, there's a normalcy to it for them. Oh, okay, you're telling me that this is just normal. And while in the moment, I would never say that to a kid necessarily, or to a person who's struggling. When you're bringing it to them and then they get in that moment, there's a lot less of that bad tapes that would be playing in your head of, I can't feel big and I can't have these big feelings and I should hide this and I should be ashamed. It's a lot easier for them to trust me or, a teacher or a parent who's saying, it's okay, we all feel big. And I always throw in my own personal examples of how I had big, intense feelings and how this will pass. Just like we don't always feel as good as we felt at the birthday party, it's the same thing there.
I know one of the shifts that I've made in my language since, I don't know, it's been a long time ago that I did this, but moving away from using the idea of describing emotions as good or bad and more to comfortable or uncomfortable, which I hear you also reflecting. Why do you feel like that is so important?
Yes, I spent a lot of time, like days and days, and going back and forth with my publishers on the terms I wanted to use in here. And I think the words we're using, it's been important that we've been mindful about them. And I think I went with pleasant and unpleasant, but like you said, comfortable and uncomfortable, because that connotation that stays with you. And I think being a big feeler myself my whole life, whether it's in my body or in my brain, and being labeled so negatively for having such intense feelings, was a really big part of why it mattered to me, is that the connotation, it's a subconscious message you're sending. And it matters.
One thing that also stood out to me, I'm always constantly thinking about language and our intentional shifts that we make. And you also made a point to talk about changing from talking about behaviors as maladaptive to instead framing them as signs of dysregulation. And when Amanda and I wrote our most recent book, Neurodiversity Affirming Schools, one of the things we really focused on was the fact that the language that we use as educators, as parents, as clinicians, whatever that might be, influences how we approach somebody who we're trying to help, how we react and how we think about the types of solutions that they need. And so when we think about this shift from maladaptive behaviors to dysregulation, it might seem like it's a small change on the surface, but it really reflects a deeper shift in how we think about behavior, especially from that neurodiversity affirming lens. So when we label something as maladaptive, we're putting the focus on the behavior being wrong or broken, something that needs to be fixed or eliminated. But when we look at it as dysregulation, that really shifts us to looking at someone who's overwhelmed or their nervous system is really struggling. Why do you see that language shift as important, and how do you see it as changing the way that adults approach behavior when they start looking through that lens of dysregulation instead of maladaptive behavior or dysfunction?
I think this came from also being an OT. You know, I'm a full-time clinician. I'm an OT in the schools. So I hear this word all the time. And as an OT, the word adaptive and adaptative and all of that is extremely important to what we do as professionals. And if you're looking at something as maladaptive, which if you do any research on what are maladaptive behaviors, they're listing things like stimming and echolalia and excessive crying and not looking at social norms and disregarding that. If you say that it's not adaptive, it's not helping you to adjust to your circumstance and meet your goals, you're not honoring that lived experience of that individual who's dysregulated. Because, okay, there's a lot of flooding in New Jersey and New York yesterday, and we were in the car and we came up right to the edge of the flooding, and I was losing my mind. I was screaming, and that was a dysregulated response, but it was adaptive in the situation because guess what? It made sure that we weren't going to go any further into that dangerous situation. And I think the same thing can be said for kids. If they're shutting down and doing work avoidance or running away or eloping, those are signs of dysregulation that are sometimes protective. This work is too hard. I'm going to refuse to do it. I'm not getting my needs met. I'm going to scream at you because you need to hear that this is not working for me. So I think if we shift to dysregulation, it's more honoring of the experience that's happening within the nervous system and who the child is.
I like that. And I think also when we describe something as either adaptive or maladaptive, that's an opinion. It's kind of a judgment call.
Yes.
It's like it depends on what that person is experiencing in that moment. And just as you were describing it, like recognizing that there are times when, for that particular individual, that may be very adaptive when you look at it within that context. It reminds me of when we talk about that double empathy problem, where we're not always looking at something. And so we're telling kids, well, you need to be more flexible. You need to adapt, differently in this situation. And we're insisting that they kind of see it from our perspective without also giving them the grace and taking the opportunity to look at it from their perspective. Why are they so dysregulated? Why is their nervous system so alert to where they're unable to, whatever the task might be or whatever the situation might be?
Right. And what is our value set versus their value set? And that gets tricky with children because maybe they're not valuing reading in this moment, but maybe they would later. But if we're talking about following social norms, is that our value set versus their value set?
Mm-hmm.
Are they saying, please help me, I'm really struggling with making friends? Or are they the kid who's like, I'm good. I have one friend and that's good.
Yeah, I think that that's a big piece of this. And it kind of actually, thinking about these values and the ways that we approach kids brings me to the next topic that I wanted to talk to you about. And I liked the way that you have phrased the term school-induced trauma, because I actually talk about this pretty frequently because in my experience, there are so many neurodivergent kids who do experience school as a traumatic environment, whether that's due to the constant masking or sensory overload or discipline issues where they're getting in trouble all of the time. They just feel misunderstood day after day. And I also know that calling it trauma can be tricky for some people. Like I've had conversations where people really push back, feeling like using the word trauma in this context minimizes what they consider more serious forms of trauma like abuse or neglect. But I just really feel like the reality is trauma is about how those experiences impact the nervous system over time. And for neurodivergent kids, school really is a place where that nervous system stress compounds every day. So when you use the term school-induced trauma, what are you really describing, and how do you see that showing up in the students that you work with, whether that's emotionally or behaviorally?
Yes. Well, I definitely, again, I really looked at the words. And when I was looking closely at the words, is it school-based? Is it school-induced? Yes, they can be used interchangeably. But school-induced trauma really defines causation. It is the school environment that is causing this trauma. And yes, I understand why some people would say that calling these situations trauma can be disregarding of some more intense traumas. But like you said, you're looking at a neurodiverse population, or I am. All of the students that I am working with and advocating for have some level of neurodiversity, and they're more at risk for trauma, and their nervous systems are more sensitive. And so, yes, it is enough to say that when they're in this situation, it can create a trauma. Now, I'm also in the situation of having been in schools that used seclusion rooms. I have seen abusive behaviors. I have seen it go unpunished. So for me, it's a very emotional and sensitive issue, because I've seen people that have been perpetrators of what I would consider traumatic, abusive situations with children be promoted and advanced and have faced no consequences. So for me, this is a very highly emotionally charged issue, because I'm seeing kids disproportionately of black and brown children facing these circumstances where maybe they're restrained more, maybe they're secluded more, or maybe they're just harassed and intimidated, or embarrassed and shamed more. And it just is something that really does not sit well with me. There's a lot of pupil intimidation. There's a lot of sarcasm, and it's having devastating consequences on children.
Well, when you have to walk into an environment every day and be treated by people who don't understand you, think that most of what you do is wrong, and aren't willing to come and walk alongside you with that in order to help you, it's like so many of these characteristics of neurodivergence are viewed as character flaws or moral failings that need to be fixed through discipline.
And it's the assumption that there's a volitional intent.
Yeah.
I'm yelling, I'm having a meltdown because I want to not listen to you. And so either I'm seeing the children being blamed or the parents. It starts at home. Mm-hmm. Regardless of what's going on at home, once they walk into that building, we have to look at them as children that are there to learn, and that we need to help and support. And having this blame game of, well, it's this, well, they're doing this to themselves, or they're just being disrespectful. It's so much bigger than that. And so that struggle to get them to see the nervous system component in a lot of these behaviors can be very frustrating.
At a time where there's more questions about the future than ever, more fear and less confidence, especially in education, we're building a collective of educators, parents, and mental health professionals where learning and sharing are front and center. And coming up on Tuesday, September 9th, we have another free event hosted by Emily Kircher-Morris and Amanda Morin about creating neurodiversity-affirming schools. You're invited to attend this live virtual event with Emily and Amanda, and we're bringing together a panel of experienced voices in the world of education to give you 90 minutes of learning, ideas, Q&A, and more that will fill your bucket and give you a certificate of completion, too, for continuing education credits. If you can't make it Tuesday, September 9th, we'll be recording the event so you can watch later and still get your CE. Again, this event is completely free. All you need to do is reserve your spot by clicking the link in the show notes, or you can go to neurodiversity.university.
We often hear the terms bottom-up processing and top-down processing. I want to point out the fact that they're often actually used in different ways within the neurodiversity community, depending on who you're talking to. I know I used to understand it kind of as one way, and then I was talking to somebody and they were using it in a different context, and I had to really kind of reflect on that. So, like, for example, you can think about language and communication where bottom-up processing usually means that someone is building directly from the words that you're saying, and they're not reading between the lines or picking up on the implied meaning or social cues. But it can also mean processing more in relation to emotional regulation, especially through a sensory lens, which is how you use those terms, top-down processing and bottom-up processing. Can you break that down? When you talk about a student reacting from a bottom-up state versus a top-down state, what is actually happening for them in those moments?
Coming from the occupational therapy lens as I do, when we're looking at bottom up and top down, it's more that subcortical reactions, which is, the non-thinking components of the brain are kind of, that's where the processing is coming from, and that's where the reactivity is coming from. So these automatic responses, a nervous system reaction or even a behavioral reaction to something that someone is experiencing versus the cognitive processing and the cognitive reaction, which would be more that top down. So for OTs, we're often looking at it as in terms of our treatments or what we're doing. Is it a top-down treatment approach where we're asking them to think about their behaviors and the consequences of their behaviors, or are we just giving them stimulation and sensory input to help change their reaction? So that's really where it comes from. And a lot of what OTs do by nature is try to blend the two. And I think that's what I'm really trying to do with this program, is show the benefits of blending the two, knowing when to jump from one to the other, with whom to jump from one to the other. I really started as a sensory integration trained therapist, and then over time saw, wait a second. So there are so many children that I am seeing that I can hit them with all the supposedly calming sensory strategies. But if I start talking about their special interest, that is really what's regulating them. Mm-hmm. And so it was really seeing the power of cognitive skills to help regulate sensory systems, which was kind of not really something being done in the sensory OT world. And that's where I kind of made that shift to understand the importance of both the brain tools and the body tools.
I like that blend and approaching it and based on what works for each individual child. You kind of gave a couple of examples there, like of talking about a special interest might be really regulating. Can you just talk a little bit more about how you might determine what approach to take with certain students?
Right. And this is really where the magic comes in, or the art of any therapy, right? So we can all read what we're supposed to do, but it always comes down to the individual child and their particular nervous system, their personality, and their reactions to. So for me in the clinic or in the school with a student, I might just have to try a bunch of different things before I say, okay, none of this works. What we have to do, okay, so maybe the sensory tools aren't working, but I'm finding that if we keep novelty and that we give them something new every 15 minutes, that's way more regulating for them because it's keeping their interest up or it's changing their focus. And a lot of this, maybe it will come down to distraction. So if you're looking at anxiety and fear, you're still technically using a cognitive process if you're using distraction, but it does have a greater impact maybe for a specific kid. Whereas, I've had kids that I've worked a lot with selective mutism where if I talk about what they're feeling, that is in no way going to help. But if I put some hip hop music on and put them on a swing, it tends to lower their anxiety level, takes the focus off of talking, and before you know it, they're feeling a little bit better. That's oversimplifying a complex issue to treat, but that's just kind of saying where I'd be going with the nervous system is what's going to make you look and feel more regulated and comfortable.
Something that I think a lot of adults struggle with, whatever our role might be, is figuring out how to know what those kids really need. I guess what I kind of get at is like, how do we help young people build their own awareness of what works for them when they're dysregulated? Like, how do we help move gradually from co-regulation to more independent self-regulation?
It definitely starts with the self-awareness and the exploration. And that's really what the curriculum sets up. And it's not one that needs to be done. You have to do it in this order. You have to do all components. It's really about that first step being exploring, what does your body feel like? And this whole concept of interoception and, where are your areas that you're struggling with or that make you uncomfortable. So it's walking any individual through self-awareness first. And I've done it from, kindergarten level up through high school, where it's, okay, let's talk about how you feel and get a better understanding for you of what you're experiencing emotionally and physically in your body and in your brain. And that once you start to practice, just like any other skill, again, going back to my OT roots, it's about repetition, revisiting the concepts, repeating it, practicing it, and making the activities, so maybe I would do an obstacle course and in there I'm talking about, doesn't this feel good on my muscles? I feel them pulling, and I love the way pulling feels on my muscles, which I really do. And, showing them, when I feel stressed out, I really like to press on my arms and just popping those topics of conversation and those teachable moments, but about teaching them about themselves. And what do you like? Does that feel, it looks like it feels good because you're smiling and you're laughing. And that seems like that's something you should remember that. Remember that you like to roll around on the floor, when you're feeling a lot of energy, and that might help you feel better. And so moving up to self-regulation from co-regulation, it's a process that I think isn't very black and white. It's not like, okay, now you've made it. It's like learning to swim. You learn to swim and you know all the steps and you can do it, but that doesn't mean that you won't need a life vest sometimes if you're in really choppy waters. And it doesn't mean that you won't need to take a break on some days. It just means that now you have the skills, you're able to do it, but you still need the right environment and setup and to feel good inside. You can't be sick. It's a different skill. And I, as an adult, I still need co-regulation sometimes.
Yeah, I think that's such a good point. It's about recognizing that you might have somebody who's able to self-regulate one day, but then the next day they might need support and more co-regulation. It doesn't necessarily always mean that they're always going to be able to do that every single day.
Right. And I do think the phrase self-regulation has been so popular, which is great sometimes, but terrible sometimes, because we're expecting, 3 and 4-year-olds to self-regulate. And that's just not part of the wheelhouse for 3 and 4-year-olds sometimes, even typically developing 3 and 4-year-olds, when they're supposed to develop these skills over time as the nervous system matures. So that's why they cry a lot when they're 3, because they're not so great at this self-regulation thing, because it's an acquired skill. It's not something we're born with.
We hear about sensory tools when it comes to supporting regulation, but you also like to talk about using things like storytelling or video games or a child's special interest to help build those regulation skills. So I would love for you to share a little bit more about that. How do you feel like those kinds of tools can be really helpful, and how do they complement the more traditional types of supports that you might see from an OT or another setting?
This definitely came from my clinical practice. And this is, I'm 30 years into being a full-time in the trenches with young children up through high school OT. And so it's taking what I've learned theoretically and clinically and in my higher education classes, and then combining it with the real life situations and looking at, okay, why did this work for this student? Storytelling is just, it's fascinating to me, like how that can be such a great cognitive tool. I do think you can strip some of it down to that distraction again. But think about it, what we read children to sleep. That is something we do that's regulating and gets kids to calm down. So if you don't have a book, it would make sense that if you told a story, unless it was a really wild and scary story, and depending on your inflection and you can use your tone of voice, but it would make sense that the storytelling would help regulate. In the same turn, I have seen kids just come in and just show me. It's beautiful how much of this I've learned through kids. I had I want to say first grader last year who would just come in and say, this is the story. He would just start making up these beautiful, creative stories. And in that process was regulating himself versus me saying, oh, well, we're going to do this contrived activity where I go on the swing and we, look for secret treasures. You're already taking me on these journeys. So it's really been honoring some of the brilliant brains that I've had the pleasure to work with and say, okay, so the special interest is, it's something you are gravitating towards and you want to share with me. So how do we use that? Now, there are times that can be dysregulating as well. A lot of these tools, video games, but, I'm also the parent of an autistic adult. So some of this was learned through parenting, through, okay, well, we can say that screen time is bad. And it was when we had to come off of it. But it was also the thing that got him through some really terrible heartbreaks and some difficult moments with peers, is because that is the special interest. That was the calming tool. It's still the soothing activity and the calming activity. And so it's learning to honor what each different nervous system is really needing.
I think one of the terms that also has become a little bit of a buzzword and has lost some meaning is mindfulness and using mindful strategies. And it's kind of lost some meaning. People don't really recognize what that really means. And then there's also this resistance. But recognizing that mindfulness is a tool that can be helpful. And when I describe this, I usually just describe it as basically a connection between what is happening physically in your body and what is happening mentally in your head and the environment, like kind of just bringing all those things together in this current moment. But a lot of those go-to tools that we hear about, like deep breathing or guided imagery, really just don't work for a lot of neurodivergent kids. Like, I've had kids who were really comfortable with some parts of that, but they would not close their eyes during an activity that felt really uncomfortable for them, or it was very difficult for them to sit completely still. And then sometimes they would be in the classroom, and then because they weren't doing those things, that would be interpreted as they're not being compliant, which I kind of roll my eyes a little bit. But recognizing that for some kids, some of these things might actually increase their dysregulation, are there some adaptations or alternatives that you've found that work better for those kids?
Absolutely. And again, reflecting back on the fact that I started this curriculum 20 years ago, and then, publication took a long time, and that's a whole other story. But when I use it, practically speaking, being true to my OT roots, it is evidence-based. And if you look at yoga and mindfulness, which are included optional activities or part of the program, it's with the caveat of, we don't have to call it yoga and we don't have to call it mindfulness, because especially my teenagers, they're done with it. They've heard it so much, and, being told it'll calm you down and you'll feel better. And it doesn't work. These are hard skills for adults. So if you have a teenager in distress, you say, do this mindful activity, you'll feel better. They're like, no, it didn't work, because it doesn't work right away, a lot of this stuff. And so they're again, skills that can be beneficial. So for yoga and for mindfulness that's involving the body and movement, I'll call it stretching, and I'll call it just moving the body. I just take those terms right out of it. Mm-hmm. And that's an easy adaptation to the resistance, right? So, and if you can't keep your body still, I've done mindfulness activities and yoga with kids that are just completely moving around. And my goal is just to get them to be there in the moment in some way, just for a second or two. That's where I would start out. I really like Go Noodles, Bring It Down. They have a video with a balloon. And if you could just get a kid to, they don't have to stand still, but to look at that balloon and notice that it's changing colors, that's a very basic, that mindfulness of, let's just look at, hey, can you tell me 3 different things you see in this room? Okay, hold this rock. Is it cold or is it hot? Boom. Start getting them to tune in to their environment in smaller steps, and acknowledge that too is mindfulness. And that's the building blocks. If you can just say, okay, well, I hear this and I see that, that's the foundational pieces that you can put into place to start getting better and better at it. And then maybe by the time they're older, they will have a greater repertoire of strategies to build on. And then for some of my high school kids, say if I'm doing guided imagery, if I call it guided imagery, I'm going to lose them. I have a lot of gamers. I have a lot of neurodiverse gamers. And I'll say, okay, so next time you're, being yelled at, because that's a trigger for you. You don't like being yelled at. Okay, I want you to experiment with going to your favorite scene in your favorite video game and just try to remember your character walking around and see if you can picture the scenery of this favorite level. And it's much more effective because, again, being that OT, I think that is key, meeting them where they're at with their occupational activity, which is their interest. And so I get a lot more, I would say, willingness to try something where they're like, wow, you just told me to use my video game for homework. And so whether it's I'm anxious at night, I can't sleep. So, let's kind of do some imagery around your game or a different place you went or a fun activity you've done. So
you focus on what the activity is as opposed to the label. And so that's a great workaround. And then meeting kids where they are.
Yes.
Yeah. So Tracey, this has been such a helpful conversation. Before we wrap up, I want to ask one last question. So if someone listening today, whether they're a parent or a teacher or a clinician, wants to start supporting a neurodivergent child in building regulation skills, where would you suggest they begin? Like, what's one small and approachable step that they could try right away?
Yes, I think the easiest thing to do to start help building is to have discussions about your own regulation and dysregulation and explaining, hey, I'm sorry I raised my voice. I'm feeling stressed out because my family's coming over. Or, hey, I did this because I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I did this because I'm tired. Does that ever happen to you? Or you sound really angry. Do you need a break? And so it's giving the language. Of course, this is simplifying it for children who have limited language abilities or limited cognitive abilities. So that's a harder thing to get into where you would adapt it. But I still, even with limited verbal language, I'm still modeling and sharing and discussing my own regulation as an adult and how it manifests, because it's a perfect example. They see my feelings, they feel my feelings, and if I am tired or if I'm seeming annoyed or frustrated, they pick up on that. And so it's a great example.
Tracey DeMaria, author of How to Surf the Waves. Thanks so much for talking to me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Emily. I really have enjoyed myself.
Tracey's surfing the waves metaphor stuck with me because it paints such a clear, empowering picture of what regulation really is. It's not about never getting upset or staying perfectly calm all the time. It's about developing the awareness and strategies to ride out the emotional waves and recover after they crash. And just like surfing, it's not something you can master overnight. It takes time, it takes falling, and it takes trying again. When we expect neurodivergent kids to just know how to regulate without that learning curve, we miss the point. But if we approach it as a skill and help them build confidence along the way, we set the foundation for lifelong emotional resilience. I'm Emily Kircher-Morris. I'll see you next time on the Neurodiversity Podcast.
So we come to this mountain all over. We will climb it again together. I will always be right by your side. And whatever this world throws our way, if the wolves come howling, I'll keep them at bay. I will always be right by your side.
Thank you to Tracey DeMaria. We enjoyed the conversation. If you'd like to read more about her, I've included some links in the show notes. Her surfing the waves metaphor has awakened something in this California boy, so I am headed out to the garage to apply a fresh coat of wax to the surfboard. Come on, it's not impossible, right? Our host is Emily Kircher-Morris. Corey Orrick is our office manager and production assistant. I'm the executive producer, Dave Morris. For all of us, thanks for listening. We'll see you out on the waves.
And whatever this world throws our way, if the wolves come howling, I'll keep them at bay. I will always be right by your side.
This is a service of the Neurodiversity Alliance.